Hello, and welcome to our webcast today. 6 questions every CISO should know how to answer. My name is Sarah Frazier, and I'm the host of our program today. However, you're not going to see much of me today because I'm going to turn it over to our 2 industry experts. I'm very excited to have with us today Norah Beers. Norah is the Chief Information Security Officer for Grayscale Investments. Norah is responsible for enterprise security risk management in IT infrastructure and support. Norah comes from Grayscale, or came to Grayscale after 12 years at Bridgewater Associates, where she led investment engineering. Prior to that, she was the head of information security for Bridgewater's front office, where she led protection of the intellectual property and assets of Bridgewater's investment engine. She's an expert in integrated risk management for financial firms and is known for her ability to minimize risk and to financial operations while executing complex technology transformations. Norah, welcome. I know that you're no stranger to our show, but we're delighted to have you back today and really are looking forward to the insights that you're going to be sharing with us.
Thank you.
Joining Norah and then facilitating the discussion is Dave Stapleton. Dave, if you've been on any of our programs, you know he's a regular here. He is also the CISO of Process Unity and formerly CyberGRX. But Dave is a cybersecurity risk professional with over a decade of experience in both the public and private sectors. He began his cyber career at the Department of Health and Human Services, where he developed and managed risk and compliance teams and led government-wide cloud security initiatives on behalf of the executive branch. Dave, in his role at Process Unity, focuses on the implementation and success of internal cybersecurity and privacy programs, as well as market-facing brand ambassadorship, such as today. Dave is a certified information systems security professional. You have the hardest acronyms here and certifications. But Dave, we're delighted to have you here. So looking forward to this. I know both of you, we sat down and we talked about what questions should CISOs know how to ask or should be looking at and know how to answer. And I know there's so many more than 6 questions, but we are limited by time today. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over to you two, and we're delighted to have you here, and thank you for the audience for joining us today. So Dave, why don't you go ahead and take the reins?
All right. Well, thank you, Sarah, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today. I'm super excited to dive into this conversation. I think it gets right at the heart of some of the most challenging aspects of a security leader's role, namely, knowing if you've actually implemented a sound security program in the first place. And then secondly, being able to effectively communicate about that program with important stakeholders. So with that said, Norah, it's a pleasure to have you here, and I can't wait to get into the questions, but anything you would like to say before we get started?
Yeah, I'm really excited for this conversation because I think it can be very overwhelming when you get into a new program, you're managing risk for a new company, because if you've been in the security world for a long time, you get in and you're going to see all kinds of holes, and having to prioritize and choose what are you going to go after first. How do you do it efficiently and effectively? How do you tell that story to some of your stakeholders, both internally and externally, is really critical to you sort of gaining trust and being able to continue on with your program and ultimately close all the holes that you see. And I think that probably there are lots of folks, whether you're a CISO or just responsible for a large area of security at your company, that could use some practical advice on how to do that.
Right, exactly. I don't know why, but something about plugging all the holes just gave me a Caddyshack. I don't know. I'm going to start to implement that some kind of way in my security program. All right. Well, then let's get to it. As a reminder for everyone, Norah and I are trying to provide answers to these questions for we're not trying to provide the answers for you. We're trying to talk about how CISOs and other security leaders can go about constructing these answers for their own programs. So I'm just going to hop right into it with our first question, which is, what are the biggest threats we expect to face in the next 12 months? And Norah, I think get started with you on this one. I love prediction and forecasting, which is kind of part of what this one is saying. The future is always uncertain, and cyber threats are always kind of in flux. So how do you go about answering this question?
Well, I think you'll end up, if you do your onboarding right, when you start in an organization, you should come out of it being able to say, what are my big risks? But the way I think you tend to go about that is like, you got to do a risk assessment. You probably are doing some portion of that yourself, just as you're going through, take an inventory of your technologies, the assets that the firm has, the sorts of sort of operational risks, but also ways that that firm may be targeted, their data may be targeted. And I think when you go through all of that, you both get a sense of, all right, where am I built up well? And where do I have, sort of a very, like a lack of maturity, which is sort of your internal view. And then externally, how might people want to hurt me? What are ways that this could go wrong? And how likely do I think that those ways are? When you marry those two things together, your priorities of what are my big problems in the short term versus the long term, I think really pop out. And that's critical, because some of the stuff that you think of, man, it would be a really terrible situation if we had, some like this massive kind of hack, might not actually be the thing that you should focus on in terms of likelihood or issue that's closest to hitting you.
Right.
And I think it's a great way to get to know your organization. And so both you doing that exercise and you talking to people around the organization or using a third party to help you do an assessment, I think will give you a good sense of what those critical pieces are.
Yeah, I agree. I oftentimes ask myself, who has motivation, either internally or externally, to cause us harm? Who would be motivated to, exfiltrate some of our sensitive data? What are our crown jewels in the first place? Like, what are those things that people will be interested in? I love asking those questions also to the executive team when I have opportunities to chat with them and get them together in a room. So yeah, I agree. That's exactly how I approach it.
And that's a great way to make security accessible to folks that are maybe not technical, but are in positions of authority in the organization.
Right.
If you can ask, hey, what's the worst thing that could happen? Or what are things that you worry about? We don't have to talk about like the technicalities of how it would happen or how we might prevent it. But it gets them invested, I think, in what you're trying to fix. Plus, folks who have been there before you were there have more of a perspective on what might matter than you do the day that you walk in the door.
100%. So we've actually answered two questions. Also, how do you get acclimated in a new environment, as well as how do you talk about biggest threats? All right, so question number 2, and we're going to move through these fairly quickly, so we can try to get to 6 of them during the course of the webinar. Question number 2 is, what are our most critical security gaps and weaknesses? This is a pretty common question for CISOs and security leaders to get from time to time. In my mind, there's a 3-step process to kind of be prepared to answer this question. And so I'll just kind of start us off on this one. First would be understanding the business priorities and objectives, and then how security aligns with and potentially enables them. You might almost think of this as like a SWOT analysis type of data. You want to know, what are our strengths and weaknesses? What are the opportunities and threats? That type of information. And it's not just focused to things that are obviously security related. You might think of new technologies, but it's also, how are we planning? What is our growth plan for the next year? Are we growing by acquisition? Are we going to, what markets are we going to be in? All those things could be influenced by security. And there's no one size fits all process for how to do this. I think the business vertical or industry, your public or private sector, whether or not you're B2B, B2C, who your customer base is, are you dealing with highly regulated organizations, and kind of the shape of your product or service all make a difference on what those priorities and objectives are from a business perspective. So that's step 1, is just knowing, what's the business all about? What are we trying to do? And then step 2 is understanding, I'm going to say, all of your gaps and weaknesses, really just carte blanche, end to end, having a sound assessment function in place that uses internal and external, hopefully, if you're following best practices, assessment or audit capabilities to help you identify and enumerate what those gaps or weaknesses may be. So you could use things like automated scans of various types, OS, code, that kind of thing, compliance, red teaming or purple teaming type exercises and tests, pen tests, of course, manual audits, all those types of things that you use to identify where there might be some kind of a weakness in your program or a gap. And then you combine steps 1 and 2 to really understand the impact that those weaknesses could have on business success. So you have to have that understanding what business success looks like, and then be able to apply it to the gaps you have. A lot of times, organizations will rely on like a business impact assessment or analysis, where you kind of get the executive review of those risk scenarios that we were talking about a second ago. Combine those with the gaps you have and say, okay, here we clearly have, these are our biggest, most critical gaps that we have to take care of, and gives you ability to prioritize and rank those. So I think that gives you a pretty good idea of what the most critical gaps or weaknesses are. But Norah, that's been the basis of my answer over the years. What do you think?
I mean, we're not too far off. What I particularly like about your first step is, I think there's two sort of critical parts to that. There's both, at times of change is when you have, the most, like the sort of most chance that something, that some new risk is going to get inserted. So when the business is pivoting or making a change, it's a really good time for you to be very plugged in as a risk manager, rather than finding out about things after the fact as they happen to you. I also really like that it gives you the opportunity to cast security as an enablement function, rather than the folks that just say no all the time. Because I do think, like, really we should be in the business of balancing risk, right? Not just inserting controls, but finding ways to make the business able to function in the way that we need and in a safe way. And I think that casts you in a really good partnership type role with the other executives in the organization, if you can sort of approach it from that perspective. I also don't know how you could possibly know what your big gaps are if you don't know what all the gaps are, because you got blind spots if you don't know all of them. And it doesn't mean that you have to prioritize all of the things that are, like, numbers 1 through 10 on a list of 100, because there could be sort of contingencies or dependencies or sort of synergies late down the list that might make it worthwhile for you to pull something else up. But if you don't have that full picture, you can't be confident that you're making good choices with 100%. Limited resources.
I find myself oftentimes asking, how do I know? It's sort of almost a philosophical question. How do I know? And I can't know what my highest priority risks are if I don't know what all the risks are. So yeah, 100%. Okay, we're moving along here. Number 3 is actually, someone snuck in an extra question here. So it's a two-parter. First part of this is, do we have sufficient resources to protect our employees' data, systems, and facilities? And then the second half of this one is, do you have the autonomy to execute your program to support the needs of your company? So Norah, since that's a two-parter, why don't we start with the question about resources? How would you answer that question of, how do you have sufficient resources to protect the organization?
So I think you have to think of resources both in terms of sort of, what do you need operationally? What do you need to run your security organization and maintain the sort of risk profile that you have going in? And then what do you need from a sort of, let's call it like a project type focus or transformational focus, in order to be able to drive down risk over time? And you probably need both, right? So you in resource costs that you can assume is what you need to get steady state, although you should always take that with a grain of salt and think about, are there efficiencies I can gain even with my existing sort of population of folks and resourcing? Don't assume that all your vendors that you inherited are good vendors, especially in the security space, where, like, there are new vendors all of the time. There's just such great competition in our space that it's really driving, I think, a lot of good innovation. And so I think you sort of starting off at, what does it cost right now? What am I getting for it? And then taking a look at what you did in the last step of, what are the big things that I need to do? What is a pace of getting there that would make me comfortable? And then don't make that decision in a vacuum. Go back to your executive team that are the ones who are gonna live this risk with you, and say, look, I could get us there with this amount of resources. I could get us there. It's going to take us 5 years. These are the practical risks that we're living in the meantime. So, like, literally, these are the things that could happen. This is the likelihood or the frequency with which I think those things could happen to us, so that they can make informed decisions about whether or not we should invest more, or whether we can afford to go more slowly and cautiously.
Yeah, definitely. I love that. I like that resource approach on the steady state plus the improvement over time, and what do you need. So the second part of that question is a doozy. Basically, do you have the autonomy to execute your security program? So in the interest of time, I'll just kind of quickly go through this. I'd say, from my perspective, first off, this is a question that you want to be able to answer with some amount of confidence before you ever even take a CISO role at an organization. This should be something that would-be CISOs try to understand before they change roles or before they switch companies, that type of thing. And it makes me think of, like a bad relationship where you hear one partner saying that they think they can change the other one. That's not very likely. And I think the same is oftentimes true here. So if you're interviewing with an organization or thinking about taking that next step into that role, and you feel that the organization considers security to be a checkbox, or that they de-emphasize the importance of the CISO role or the security leader's role, if the CISO is meant to be sort of the fall guy in the aftermath of an incident, those things should all make us, I think, very wary. So that's not necessarily a direct answer to the question as it was posed, but I hope that's a helpful conceptualization of that idea of, do you have the autonomy? That's a very early on kind of a question you need to answer for yourself before you get involved. All right, question number 4. What are the current top priorities for our security program? I think we kind of got into this one already, so I'll just get us started again. I think it begins with the understanding of those priorities, like we talked about before. If you're trying to run and prioritize your security program in isolation from the rest of the business, I think that oftentimes will result in misalignment, which means you're not going to enjoy the support of organizational leaders, likely struggle to obtain budget, as we were just talking about, and likely have suboptimal kind of outcomes for those security initiatives. But for me, this breaks down into kind of 3 inputs to help me answer that question. One is those business goals and objectives. So I think of what is the success criteria for the company. A second is the threats and weaknesses. We already talked about that. Who has motivation? What sort of techniques would they use? What controls would be most appropriate to prevent, detect, or respond to those techniques? And then how good are those controls that I've got in place? So that's that second input. I think the third input for me is oftentimes non-negotiable expectations is kind of how I think of it. Those are things like regulatory compliance, customer due diligence or commitments, budget to some degree. I guess there is some opportunity to negotiate with budget, but it is finite unless you're very lucky. There is a finite budget at some point for your organization. So I think combining those 3 elements gives us the ability to identify what's most important and what's most urgent for our security programs. But love to hear your thoughts on that, Norah. What I missed there?
Well, I like that you framed it in considering both important and urgent.
Right.
Because I think in security, particularly when you're building a program, you've both, as we mentioned, have operational responsibilities, you have ongoing stuff, and you're also trying to build, which often is over a long time frame. And so it's really, really easy. We're so reactive to be just dealing with stuff as it comes. And those long-term goals are going to get pushed further and further out if you're not careful. So the thing that I would add is mostly, how do you stay focused on those things? You got your list of what matters. How do you stay focused on those things? This is genuinely true. I carry around with me a piece of paper when I go to any one of my meetings with executives who are focused on lots of other things and can very easily get distracted by stuff that's just right in front of them, not the most important thing from a risk perspective. I carry around a piece of paper that has 2 things on it. It's got my risk map, and it's got my like priority list of like projects that we're doing for the year. And I do it for 2 reasons. 1, to keep me focused, and 2, to assist me in keeping them focused. Right. And so if I've got something new that's coming up and I can say, all right, where is this on the risk map? Is it something that really matters that we need to be focused on or not? And if we've got to add something to the list, what else is coming off? Right. We have a certain amount, to your point, unless we have unlimited resources, we have a certain amount of resources that we have to work with. We can't just be adding things all the time realistically. And so I think you need to deal with the implications of any change to your priority list when you make the change, not be surprised by it.
I love the idea of having that piece of paper in the pocket. I might start doing that. I might steal that one from you, because it's so easy to get wrapped up in a conversation and start to rearrange your priorities without really thinking it through, without looking at a list and go, oh, wait, 1 in, 1 out. Like if we're going to prioritize that, then what on this list needs to drop off? And sometimes that's eye-opening when we realize, shoot, there's really nothing on this list that can drop off. We're going to have to, put that in the backlog to come to later. So I love the idea of having that like hard copy right there in my hands in black and white. Awesome. All right. So question number 5 is, Are we prepared to respond to a major security incident? This one's pretty huge. It's also fairly common, I think, at least in my experience, to get this kind of a question from a CEO or even a board. So, Norah, I'm curious. One, do you get this question very often, and how do you go about responding to it?
Yeah, I think on this one, it is really important not to let perfect be the enemy of good.
Yeah.
You're never perfectly prepared to respond to an incident, but you've got to have something in place as soon as possible. And so, get your version 1 plan and then start testing. I love to use tabletop tests in order to be able to sort of find the things that I need to change about my plan and make it very iterative. It has the added benefit of giving everybody else in the organization that would be involved in the event of an incident used to how would they need to engage in such a scenario before it's actually as high pressure of a situation as an incident is. So I think that's really important. I think it's really useful to get outside eyes. So if you can have somebody else facilitate those tabletop exercises so that you can it makes it a little bit easier for you to not have to play 2 roles at the same time when you really need to be sort of evaluated objectively about where you are. And don't treat not doing well on the first one as like it's just a learning opportunity. That's how you get better and how you make your organization more safe. And I think you'll learn all kinds of things. What kind of partners do I need to go put in place? Do I have breach counsel? Should I be getting insurance? What are the steps that I have to take once I get insurance? What are other sorts of controls that maybe could make me feel a little bit more comfortable in those scenarios? And then prioritize those by both what are my big impact ones, but not very likely, and also what are the ones I'm going to hit all the time that, man, I really should have a playbook for.
Right, exactly. I was going to mention the run book piece of it. It's something that we do a lot where you start to see certain types of scenarios potentially occur. We get, different types of phishing, or I guess they're calling it quishing now with the QR codes. So some forms of those social engineering attacks. So we want to have a really clear run book on exactly how to respond to those things well in advance of anything hopefully becoming successful in our environment. So we prioritize those, like you just said, based on what are the types of threats or incidents that we think are most likely to happen in our environment based on what we actually see, the attempts that are made, and then of course which ones have the biggest impact. And it's amazing, in the heat of the moment during an incident, I think fight or flight kind of hits us, and that cognitive ability gets wiped out. And suddenly you're just acting on like fear and instinct to some degree, and it's harder to think through, I think, objectively about what to do next. And having that black and white checklist of at least go through these steps readily available makes me feel a lot more confident that we'll be able to respond efficiently and effectively in the case of an actual incident. Okay, moving on. Number 6. Do we have adequate risk oversight of our third parties, vendors, and contractors? I really love this one because it is right in Process Unity and CyberGRX's wheelhouse. I think that most security and business leaders would agree that third-party risk is one of the most prevalent and impactful risk domains that we think about today. Nearly every company in the world has significantly increased their utilization of third parties in recent years. And along with it is the potential exposure to risk, which originates with those vendors. So the idea of third-party risk increasing over time, I think, is just kind of exponentially increased, particularly in the last 10 years or so. So I say all that to say that no CISO should be surprised to get this type of a question. It's third-party risk is out there. I think we may or may not be the redheaded stepchild of cybersecurity domains. I think we're actually rising up the ranks a little bit. So increasing importance for sure. In my opinion, in order to say yes to that question, do we have adequate risk oversight? You need a few key elements to be included in your third-party risk management program. So the first bit of that is, TPRM has got to be embedded in the vendor procurement and offboarding workflows within your organization. It kind of goes back to that old saying, you can't protect if you don't know you have it. Third parties are so easy to engage with now for our employees. Basically, all you need is an internet connection and a credit card, and away you go. Next thing you know, you've got production data all over the place. So we really have to have a tight alignment with those procurement teams to make sure that we know when we're considering bringing on and approving a new third party, and conversely, when we're getting ready to terminate a contract with a third party, so we can handle that properly. So that's one very important piece. Another is the inherent risk that's associated with all the third parties has to be clearly understood. That inherent risk calculation, and don't have time, we could do a whole another 30 minutes on inherent risk and how to assess it, but basically it is, what is the potential impact that this third party could have on me if there was some sort of a compromise or a situation that occurs with them. That is the basis for basically the rest of the third party risk management process. It determines the level of rigor that you're going to use to assess what amount of risk you would be willing to accept, that type of thing. So that inherent risk process has got to be real tight and fully understood. Kind of building off of that, the risk assessments that get conducted, whatever flavor or shape they may be, you should use CyberGRX and Process Unity for that. But in case you don't, whatever those risk assessments are need to be conducted in accordance with that inherent risk. So you wouldn't apply the same level of rigor, for example, to a janitorial service that has access to a non-sensitive facility as you would to the cloud hosting provider that hosts your production application, for example. So you need to make sure that that's tailored appropriately. That's an efficiency play, and also good for establishing and maintaining good relationships with your third parties. The next piece of it is, and it's so funny how often this seems to not bubble up for folks, is you've got to have an actual risk treatment process in place to address the risks associated with your third parties. So many people want to check the box and say, we've assessed our third parties. And that's not it. You're not done yet. You're not really managing risk by just assessing third parties. So you have to have that risk treatment process, I think, in place and ready to go. And then lastly, I would say, especially because of how quickly things change, that a monitoring program of some kind has been implemented to identify and report on risks that emerge kind of outside of your normal assessment cycle. We're well past the point, I think, where we can say some sort of point in time annual or maybe biannual assessment is somehow going to cut it. Things just change too quickly and threats can emerge, and we need to be have better ways to stay on top of those. So I think if you have those 5 things in place and operating effectively, then you can say, yes, we have an adequate oversight of our third parties. But Norah, I'd love to get your insight. I spend all day, every day thinking about third party risk, but what do you think?
Well, I mean, first, I love that it's finally a topic that we're focusing on. I think for a really long time in this industry, it was wildly under prioritized. And I'm sure it was hacks that affected folks that started to get it the attention that it deserves. But there is a tremendous amount of risk, and it varies by industry and type of firm that you're in, but a tremendous amount of risk sitting with third parties that you do not have as much control over as you do over your own organization. So many of the things that you said resonated with me as I was thinking through, my last couple of gigs and how I had to think about third-party risk and manage it. I do think, just like with your broader set of security priorities, you having a full picture of all of your third parties and you've racked and stacked them against each other and have a sense of where does it present real risk is critical. I also think it's not just security risk. This is where you need to be working hand in hand with business continuity if you don't oversee it yourself. Yeah. Because it's, obviously you could be impacted by a security incident, one of these places, but also you need to be able to stay operational if one of these places that you're relying on has a major incident. And so I'm responsible at my current place for business continuity, but were I not, I would want a really strong partnership with the person who owned that, as well as with all the teams, to make sure that, that we're not being too myopic and thinking about who do we care about. I also think it is so critical that you bottleneck the heck out of the procurement process. Yes. Just today, I was editing my annual security training that I'm going to do for our employees in just a couple of weeks. And I put in there, you may not sign up for free trials, agree to terms and conditions. All of that is just like signing a contract. You think it's not because it's easy or because we have you could put a subscription on a corporate credit card, but getting people to realize that what they're doing is actually much more impactful than it feels, and that companies want your data, and they do not have your best interests at heart, and they may not have the right contractual controls or other sorts of monitoring in place that you need, is really critical. And all the employees need to understand that, because somebody's going to find some way around it. And then I think you're right. Like, if you can ahead of time, when you're building that process into procurement, lay out what are the different sorts of controls or risk mitigants that we could put in place depending on what we find while doing these risk assessments, it will make it more of a smooth process, not just for you and the third party, but also for your business partners within the organization who you want as allies, right? If you are reasonable and practical in giving more attention and time to the high risk stuff than the low risk stuff, people think, okay, this is reasonable. It's not a crazy burden they're putting on me. And if you can say, all right, we have like standard language for contracts. We have, rules about resiliency and operational reliance that what sorts of operational controls we would like to put in place for those sorts of vendors, rules about how to back and some of that kind of stuff sort of pre-made. It lets you then focus your extra cycles on the weird ones that need more creative energy, especially if you're starting from scratch and doing third-party risk management for, all your existing vendors sort of from the get-go.
The backlog, exactly. And I like the piece about continuity as well. You mentioned before that, when we were talking about how many cool vendors and tools there are, especially in the security space, but that also creates, I think, some volatility. And so you can't necessarily expect that they're going to be around forever. So how do you make sure that you haven't over leveraged yourself with one particular vendor with no other options, that kind of thing? It's a great part of third-party risk that we don't think about nearly enough. All right, well, we are at time. And Norah, I got to say, I'm really pleased that we were able to cover that much in that short period of time. I want to thank you again for joining me and sharing some incredible insights with myself and the audience. And speaking of the audience, thank you all for being with us today as well. I hope you found this discussion valuable and practical. If you'd like to learn more about how Process Unity and CyberGRX can help you answer tough questions like these, you can indicate your interest when you exit the webinar, and we'll be sure to have someone contact you. But thanks again, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.